opening days of the American Revolution, Charleston was one of the most important sites in the 13 original colonies. The largest city south of Philadelphia. It was a major shipping transportation port and a population center for the new emerging nation. As a result, this needed to be defended. So early in 1776, South Carolina patriots moved out here onto Sullivan's Island and began building a fort made of palmetto logs and sand. Two palmetto log walls about 16 feet apart, standing almost as high and filled in with sand in between to help guard the entrance to Charleston Harbor against an invasion from the sea. There's some significance in the use of palmetto logs and sand in the construction of the fort. First of all, when they were building the fort, normally you would build a fort out of brick or stone, but they didn't have enough time to do that. They had to use the building materials that were available to them here in the area. So they used the palmetto logs. If you look at a palmetto tree, it's a fairly straight, tall tree, kind of like a pine tree. So if they cut down that palmetto tree and cut the top out of it, they had a fairly straight log they could use to build with. And there's literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them here in the area. So that was the most easiest building material they had to build a fort out of. So they used those, put up those two fort walls, and then put the sand in between. So what happens during the battle is the palmetto log is very spongy. So when the cannonballs hit it, instead of shattering or breaking apart like an oak log or something like that, these palmetto logs would just absorb the cannonballs or let the cannonballs pass through and do very little structural damage to the fort. At the same time, when the Patriots fired their cannons at the British warships, they're tearing up riggings and masts and sails and hitting the oak planking of the British warships, doing much more damage to them than what the British cannonballs were doing to them. On June 28, 1776, the fort was about half completed. Mounted about 30 cannons, had over 300 Patriot defenders when 9 British warships attacked carrying almost 300 cannon. The battle will last 9.5 hours, and at the end of that battle, the British Navy would have been defeated, and the first major victory in the American Revolution was won here on June 28, 1776. The importance of the Patriot victory here on June 28, 1776, if you think about it, that's just a few days before the issuance of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776 in Philadelphia. So it was a major, significant early victory in our American bid for independence and nationhood. So it had a significant impact over the course, especially early in the American Revolution. Now, after the battle, the fort would be completed and play a role in the siege of Charleston in 1780. But, of course, Charleston and all its defenses fell to the British in May of 1780. After the Revolution, this fort would be abandoned by the military. We just didn't have a large government at that time, didn't have a lot of financial backing, and so this fort was one of the places abandoned by the military after the Revolution. The fort rapidly went into decay and was an abandoned site, and wasn't played any significance again until much later, starting in the 1790s, when a new Fort Moultrie would be built on site here. By the 1790s, activities are heating up in Europe, leading to the Napoleonic Wars, especially between England and France. Now, there's a possibility we may get involved on one side or the other in that conflict. Plus, the French didn't want us trading with the British, and the British didn't want us trading with the French. So an effort was made to improve our defenses again in case we went to war. So the military came back and decided to build a new Fort Moultrie here on site to continue to protect the important port of Charleston. So a new fort was built here on site and completed in 1798. Essentially, almost where we're standing right now is about where the second Fort Moultrie was located. But it only lasted 6 years. The hurricane of 1804 came along and essentially destroyed the fort. And that was the end of the second Fort Moultrie. Settlers here look to put out an outward line of defense and hopefully can defeat an enemy naval force before they get within range of the city itself. So by 1708, 1709, they've built Fort Johnson out on Windmill Point on James Island. So an outward line of defense to hopefully protect the city and defeat an enemy naval force before they get within range of Charlestown itself. That fort would be completed 1708, 1709, but then as time goes on, it would not receive funding or have a permanent garrison. It would be abandoned. The British decided to rebuild it or improve it again in the 1750s. So the fort was kind of restored or rebuilt at that time. It's abandoned again. Then the Patriots take it over in 1775, 1776. They maintain it and hold on to it until the British come in during the siege of Charleston in 1780. It falls back into British hands, and when the British withdraw from the Charleston area, Fort Johnson goes back over into Patriot hands again. It's abandoned after the American Revolution. It sees some activity around the War of 1812, but it's seriously damaged in hurricanes after that point. And by the 1820s, we're still not exactly sure, it's abandoned by the United States military. Its last function by the United States military before the Civil War, we think that they may have stored some of the building materials being used for Fort Sumter at that point and then ferry it over to the fort site. With South Carolina's secession from the Union, South Carolina forces would go over and reestablish Fort Johnson again, build some fortifications there, some mortar batteries, and it was from a mortar battery at Fort Johnson that on 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, that a 10-inch mortar shell would be fired at Fort Sumter. That shell would explode directly over top of the fort, and that was a signal for every Confederate gun that could bear on Fort Sumter to open fire, and essentially the first shot of the American Civil War is fired from Fort Johnson. The fort would be improved and greatly strengthened by the Confederates over the course of the war. After the war, of course, it would be abandoned by the Confederates and really not see any use as a military installation by the United States military, and essentially become an abandoned military site after that.
Fort Sumter, as you know, sits on an island here in the center of Charleston Harbor. It was strategically located here because it would provide protection for Charleston, which is an important seaport today, as it was a century and a half ago. By selecting Fort Sumter, it would work in conjunction with existing forts, Fort Johnson on James Island, Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, and eventually batteries added on Morris Island. And a lot of folks may not be aware of this little-known fact that Fort Sumter sits on a man-made island. It took approximately 10 years to build the island. It's 2.5 acres. Over 70,000 tons of rock and granite was actually hauled here from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine to actually build this 2.5-acre island. So here we have Yankee soil here in South Carolina holding up a Civil War fort. Once the 31 years of work came to an end of the building of this fort, then it changed from a construction process to a wartime edifice. Now, after the fall of 1860, there's a drumline of events that began moving us toward Fort Sumter in the Battle of 1861. First, the election of Lincoln in 1860 in November, which was a critical point in Fort Sumter's story because our nation was now faced with a decision of who would continue to operate the government of the United States for the next 4 years. You have Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, who espoused not ending slavery where it currently exists, but wanted to stop it from going into new parts of the territory. So South Carolinians have to make a decision, do we support this man? And as we know, Lincoln was elected, and there soon about, on the 20th of December 1860, this state here, South Carolina, became the first to succeed to actually leave the Union, which would pose a problem now for Major Robert Anderson, a figure that was here in Charleston. He was the commander of American forces, and under his command were some 84 soldiers stationed at Fort Moultrie, Fort Johnson, Castle Pinckney, and the arsenal in downtown Charleston. So now Major Anderson, seeing that the state has technically left the Union, he has to make a decision. So on the day after Christmas, he packed up his men, their families, yes, and children, and moved them out here to Fort Sumter. So that now moves Fort Sumter into the limelight of the American story in terms of the coming events of the American Civil War. When you look at that movement of Major Anderson to Fort Sumter, now the state of South Carolina, or now the Republic of South Carolina, has to make a decision. Do we allow Major Anderson to remain in this fort, or do we ask him to leave? And if he refuses to leave, what do we do next? And so with that, the timeline continues into January of 1861, when on January the 9th, 1861, cadets from the Citadel stationed on Morris Island would fire upon an unarmed merchant ship, the Star of the West, that was sent here by President James Buchanan to resupply Anderson. Later on in January, other states would join the state here in secession: Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. So now there are 7 states that have made that decision to leave the Union, all focusing its attention once again here on Fort Sumter, which moves us now, as I said, to April of 1861, when down the new Confederate President, James Jefferson Davis, instruct Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard, the Confederate commander, to make a decision, to ask Anderson to leave, but if Anderson refuses to leave, then he must be removed out here by force. Thus, Fort Sumter is in the limelight of our American story.
what happens is Charleston is such an important port on the South Atlantic coast of our new nation. Even though the second fort was destroyed in the hurricane in 1804, the military determined they still needed to have a fort here to guard Charleston. So they came in after the destruction of the fort in the hurricane of 1804 and started to build a new one here and completed it in 1809. It was a brick fort, and it has survived and been used continuously in some shape or fashion until 1947 by the military. So this fort has been through here and experienced the War of 1812, the Mexican War, of course the American Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. This fort saw service. It only saw combat, though, during the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The fort was made of brick walls. It originally was designed to mount 40 cannon. Shortly thereafter, it was redesigned and improved to mount 50 cannon and was designed to hold 250 officers and men to live in officers' quarters and barracks buildings within its walls. It was to guard Charleston Harbor because of its location right here on Sullivan's Island at the entrance to the harbor in conjunction with the main shipping channel to provide enough firepower to try to keep enemy ships from trying to get in and capture Charleston. There was no action here during the War of 1812, and as time goes on, especially into the 1830s and 40s, Fort Moultrie became one of the best duty stations in the entire United States Army because of its proximity to Charleston with its restaurants, theaters, and culture and society. This is one of the best places for especially a United States Army officer to be stationed in those time periods, especially before the American Civil War. Future Civil War generals like Confederate General Braxton Bragg was stationed here at one time, and Union General William T. Sherman was also stationed here as a regular United States Army officer in the 1840s. So they all had essentially fond memories of their time here as lieutenants right out of West Point serving here at Fort Moultrie. When you enter the fort, you're going to see a yellow section of the fort, kind of almost like a butter color. The large yellow building in the fort you'll see is the powder magazine, where they would store the gunpowder necessary to fire the cannons. That was one of the most important and most dangerous places in a fort because you had so much gunpowder, cannon powder stored in these facilities. It had to be specially protected and specially taken care of to guard against any sparks or any type of static electricity that could cause that to go up prematurely. So you had to be very, very careful in a fort. Now, there were up to 50 cannons made to mount in this fort at one time. We have several different types of cannons in the fort. We have 32-pounder cannons behind me. That meant that this cannon was made to fire a solid cast-iron cannonball weighing 32 pounds. It could fire that cannonball over 1 mile. They also had exploding cannonballs called shell, which were times where they could blow up in the air or after they'd gone inside of a building or a ship and blow up inside and hopefully set it on fire. They had other types of cannonballs called K-shot, loaded with shrapnel inside. So they could do various different things depending on what they were shooting at, a ship, how close the ship was, and what they were trying to do to it. The biggest cannons we have in the fort are the 15-inch Rodman cannons. The barrels on those guns weigh approximately 50,000 pounds apiece. Using 30 pounds of gunpowder, they could shoot a 440-pound cannonball up to 4.5 miles. And one of the things that's really interesting or neat about all this is they could move the cannon barrel up or down, and when they had it at the proper angle, they could shoot that 440-pound cannonball out of it, and the cannonball would come out and skip across the surface of the water. If you were taking a flat stone and skipping it across the surface of a creek or a pond. It was called ricochet fire, and that cannonball would skip along and hit the enemy ship at or near a water line. If you put a big hole in the side of the ship at the water line, it would fill up with water and make the ship sink. So it was a very easy thing to do. Plus, the enemy ship has to stay in the confines of the channel. If it moved too far to the left or to the right in the channel, it's going to hit a sandbar, it's going to hit the shallows, it's going to run aground. So you position this fort so it can shoot down the shipping channel at approaching enemy ships, and you skip those cannonballs down the channel. It's kind of like going bowling for ships. If you visit Fort Moultrie today, you will see the modernization or the transition of this fort from its establishment in 1809 all the way up to its final use during World War II. So this is the only place in our nation where this story is told. So as you walk through the fort, you'll see cannons dating to the pre-Civil War era, to the Civil War, after the Civil War, and then all the way up to World War I, World War II. So it's a very unique site where it encapsulates in a small space United States Seacoast Defense essentially from 1809 to 1947. If we go all the way back to the story we tell here with the first Fort Moultrie dating back to 1776, we tell the entire story of United States Seacoast Defense in this one site from 1776 to 1947, a 171-year story. This is the only place in our nation where this story is told. An important chapter in our nation's history is all told right here at Fort Moultrie.